So I used to be known for making Oregon Ducks videos, but I had largely retired from that years ago and, moved on in my career. You might remember the work I used to do for fishduck.com or Campus Attic, bringing some long-lost University of Oregon history to light. Yahoo even called me the official, unofficial Oregon historian. The announcement on Friday about an end to the use of the term Civil War to define the annual football contest between Oregon and Oregon State, and the subsequent online backlash against the former student athletes who bravely led this effort, made me feel obligated to provide a little history and perhaps some levity once more on the topic of Oregon history. It started with a collective of alumni student athletes calling for an end to use of the term Civil War to define the Oregon State game. And let me start off by saying I am all for the change. If people found the use of the term Civil War offensive in any way, by all means, let's ditch it and let's move on. It really isn't that big of a deal. The games are what's important, not what we call the games. So let's ditch the Civil War, move on. The change that's coming to this country is long overdue for all the sins of the past. Way too many to name right now. This is minor compared to some of the real issues that are being addressed across this country right now. But I wanted to touch on how this series between Oregon and Oregon State got its name and how it's been misconstrued for years to be associated with the American Civil War, which honestly, it has no affiliation whatsoever. So please bear with me for a couple minutes. Hopefully I can make this entertaining or at least educational. So the University of Oregon and Oregon State is one of the oldest football rivalries in the country. And let's be frank, there have been some absolutely insane things happen surrounding this series. A post-game riot in 1910 made it simply too dangerous to hold the games for 2 years, and when it came back, it had to be held on neutral ground in Albany. In 1940, Oregon students actually stole Oregon State's goalposts, drove them all the way back to Eugene, and paraded them around Mac Court during a dance. In 1957, the Oregon State Homecoming Court was actually kidnapped by University of Oregon students posing as press before the parade started, and they were held ransom for 12 hours. There's been numerous attempts to blow up the Oregon O on Skinner's Butte with dynamite. In 1972, there was a post-game brawl on the field between fans. And in 1983, the teams played quite arguably the worst football game in college football history. It's the last 0-0 tie ever, affectionately known as the Toilet Bowl. And that's just scratching the surface of all the craziness that has happened between Oregon and Oregon State students and fans. But if we want to know how a game in Oregon, about as far away from the American Civil War battlefields as you can possibly get, got the name Civil War, we got to go back to 1937. So the term Civil War had actually been floated years earlier. Oregon coach Prink Callison is credited as being the first to use it to describe the game when he was talking to reporters in the late 1920s about how his team had played. But it didn't really stick as far as a moniker for the game. 1937 is where the name Civil War really took off. This was 30 years before Autzen Stadium was built. Oregon played its games at Hayward Field, which was built in 1919 as a football stadium with a sawdust field, and a cinder track was added in 1921 for track and field. The sawdust was used to replace Kincaid Field, which stood where much of the quad is now on campus, and for most football seasons, that area turned into a giant mud bog. The games were just a slop fest. They figured sawdust would soak up water better. So that's why Hayward Field didn't have grass. It had sawdust. By the way, if you venture out onto the quad, there's a plaque near the Schnitzer Museum that marks the site where Kincaid Field once was. So Oregon played on that sawdust field for years, and by the late 1930s, a campaign was started by University of Oregon students to fundraise for a grass field for Hayward. Funds were raised and a new field was installed just a couple days before the final game of the year when Oregon welcomed Oregon State. So to lay claim to Oregon's new field, some Oregon State College Aggies, that's what OSU is known back then as, OSC Aggies, they broke in the night. And before the game, they burned the letters OSC onto the brand new turf that students had spent all year fundraising for. The day of the game, Hayward welcomed the biggest crowd that Oregon had ever seen to date. They even had an internationally famous opera singer attend the game with multiple state dignitaries, and she was scheduled to perform a concert at Mac Court afterwards. Oregon cheerleaders paraded a cow in the back of a truck around the track before the game, insinuating that they had kidnapped the Oregon State fans' girlfriends. In response to that, Oregon State students kidnapped Puddles, Oregon's live mascot, and held it for the game. And just to clarify, this is Puddles, this is the duck. Puddles, the duck. And this is nightmare fuel of an early attempt at the duck once Puddles was retired. Now, the funny thing about that is that Puddles actually lived at Oregon State, even though Puddles was the University of Oregon mascot. Being a live duck, it was tended to by Oregon Ag students during the off-season. So with a couple minutes left in the game, Oregon State is winning 14-0 and just burning the clock at the south end of Hayward Field when a group of Oregon State students stormed the north end to try to pull down the goalposts. Well, University of Oregon students, in turn, they rushed the field, and suddenly there was a big mob surrounding the goalposts at the north end, and of course a fight broke out in the end zone. One Oregon State student even tried to climb up the goalpost to tear him down, and once he did, he had his pants ripped down, and he exposed himself to the crowd. So they eventually did tear down the goalposts, and they marched it all through campus triumphantly and got pelted with garbage along the way by Oregon students and residents. And that should have been it. Game over. Congrats, Aggies. You win. Move on. We'll see you next year. But they didn't. 2 days later, Monday morning, a group of Oregon State students felt the need to really rub it in, really gloat. So they formed a convoy of cars and headed south for Eugene to gloat some more. A gas station owner in Junction City noticed all of these students basically clinging to the outside of cars headed south towards Eugene. So he called the University of Oregon and warned them so that when the Oregon State students arrived, they were greeted on campus by the University of Oregon president and the Oregon Marching Band. And they congratulated them on their victory, and they even played the Oregon State fight song, hoping that that would quell the situation. The students even got a police escort to drive down what is now Franklin Boulevard to ride around celebrating and for some reason waving corn stalks. I guess that was their thing back then to rub it in. In response, they had water balloons thrown at them, and some University of Oregon students even hooked up a fire hose to spray down. So at that point, most of the Oregon State kids headed home to Corvallis, but a few stuck around and decided that they still wanted to start something. And they did. They started a fight on campus with some University of Oregon students. Once that brawl kind of came to an end, the Oregon State students left for downtown Eugene to get lunch at Seymour's Cafe. But word spread quickly once students got out for lunch break that there'd been a fight on campus and that all of these Oregon State students had headed downtown. And almost instantly, an angry mob of hundreds of University of Oregon students and some residents too surrounded Seymour's Cafe. So the Oregon State troublemakers barricaded themselves inside the restaurant and watched helplessly as their cars got overturned in the street by the mob. Then the restaurant owner kicked them out before Seymour's got destroyed, and they were very quickly captured. So the instigators had their heads shaved, some were thrown into the mill race, a few others were frog marched up to Skinner's Butte to undergo a humiliating freshman initiation back then known as painting the O. And it was only then that the police stepped in and strongly urged the Oregon State students that perhaps this would be a good time that they leave Eugene and go back to Corvallis. The next day, the Eugene Register-Guard newspaper ran the headline, "OSC invades Eugene, war follows." That headline is credited as being the inspiration for why the annual series is called the Civil War. Yes, the term had been used a couple times previously, going back to the 1920s, but this moment, this 1937 riot, was really the moment when the Civil War became the Civil War in Oregon. Now, I get it. Most people don't remember the 1937 riot, and television has played up the Civil War aspect of the series even more, misconstruing it as being part of the American Civil War. But its origins are from a student brawl, not the American Civil War of the 1860s and all of the implications that come with that war. Still, if the use of Civil War is outdated, if it offends, then get rid of it. Let's not pretend that there isn't some serious problems in Oregon's history that need to be addressed, like these. or the fact that one of Oregon's buildings on campus was built thanks to a large donation from the KKK. There's a lot of very unfortunate, tragic history in our past, and we should learn from that and find ways to be better going forward. So I was thinking of what to call it now, and my tweet about it went viral, at least among Oregon fans. If we're going to ditch the term Civil War, how about the Turf War instead? And here's my thinking on that. Think of Oregon State's burning of the new grass in 1937 as the first shot, the Fort Sumter, as it were, in the Turf War. Oregon's 1953 revenge, when the UO logo was burned onto the grass on the Oregon State campus late at night, is a reprisal. Plus, there's the 2010 incident at Reser Stadium when one drunk idiot lit a Beavers shirt on fire and damaged Reser's turf in celebration after Oregon had clinched its first trip to the national championship. Plus, and with all due respect to Junction City and Brownsville and some of those areas, between Eugene and Corvallis, there's not a whole lot going on except for a whole bunch of grass seed farms. Plus, Oregon has quite the reputation for being fond of, let's say, another kind of grass. So I say call it the Turf War. It's historical, capping the relevant start and end of the Civil War name for the games. And I think it's kind of cool. So the Turf War. And on a positive note, there's also a lot from our history to be incredibly proud of. Oregon has really led the way for change in a lot of things, and we shouldn't forget that while addressing a lot of the bad things from our past. Oregon embraced women's sports very early on. Say hi to the 1894 women's basketball team and 1914 baseball team. In 1926, Charles Williams and Bobby Robinson were the first two black football players at the University of Oregon, two of the earliest across the entire country. Robinson was the second black quarterback at a major university in the entire country, behind only Fritz Pollard, who's now in the NFL Hall of Fame. In the 1930s, there was Charles Patterson in basketball and Mac Robinson in track and field, Jackie Robinson's older brother, who won the silver medal at the 1936 Olympics, just a step behind Jesse Owens. Both left Hitler's Nazis in the dust. In 1931, Oregon football had Joe Lillard, known as the Midnight Express or Happy Joe, who was dominating the league until USC made a false claim to get him kicked out, conveniently right before they had to play against him. Lillard went on to play in the NFL in 1933, 14 years before Jackie Robinson played for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and was so good in the NFL that the NFL owners decided thereafter to ban black athletes from competing. There was Woodley Lewis, who in the 1940s, after leading the country in kickoff returns and being the first black athlete to ever compete at the Cotton Bowl, became the third black athlete drafted in the NFL. And it's more than just black athletes. Say hi to Chai Sung Pai, the first Korean-born college baseball player at the University of Oregon in 1923. And there's a lot from our history to be proud of beyond sports. The very first student film in history ever made anywhere, Ed's Co-Ed, was written and performed by University of Oregon students. Oregon embraced black performers at a time when many were barred from performing at universities across the country. And can we talk style for a quick minute? I mean, come on. Seriously. I want that sweater. If anyone knows where I can get that outfit, please let me know. This entire country has things from its past to be ashamed of, amends that need to be made, and things to also celebrate. Both schools have tremendous accomplishments, much more than just where Nike was founded. The schools rank among the best in the country for fields such as law, music, journalism, marketing, engineering, agriculture, science, and more. So it's time to move on from the Civil War name, and I'm okay with that. Let's support those who have battled on the gridiron on both sides in their call to end it. It's been fun, but if it offends, then time to ditch it for something new. It doesn't change the fact that we still get to enjoy the games whenever we can safely gather again, just under a different name. I say #TurfWar. So I hope you learned something. I hope this brought some levity to the argument, and fans claiming to be mad about the schools dropping the Civil War name need to get a life. And as always, go Ducks.